taking attendance. I flew to London a few weeks later. I was covering Wimbledon, the world's premier tennis competition, and one of the few events I go to where the crowd never boos and no one is drunk in the parking lot. England was warm and cloudy, and each morning I walked the tree-lined streets near the tennis courts, passing teenagers queued up for leftover tickets and vendors selling strawberries and cream. Outside the gate was a newsstand that sold a half dozen colorful British tabloids featuring photos of topless women, paparazzi pictures of the royal family, horoscopes, sports, lottery contests, and a wee bit of actual news. Their top headline of the day was written on a small chalkboard that leaned against the latest stack of papers, and usually read something like Diana in row with Charles or Gaza to team give me millions. People scooped up these tabloids, devoured their gossip, and on previous trips to England I had always done the same, but now for some reason I found myself thinking about Muri whenever I read anything silly or mindless. I kept picturing him there in the house with the Japanese maple and the hardwood floors, continuing his breath, squeezing out every moment with his loved ones, while I spent so many hours on things that meant absolutely nothing to me personally. Movie stars, supermodels, the latest noise out of Princess Di or Modena, or John F. Kennedy Jr. In a strange way, I envied the quality of Murray's times even as I lament its diminishing supply. Why did we bother with all the distractions we did back home? The O.J. Simpson trial was in full swing, and there were people who surrendered their entire lunch hours watching it, then taped the rest so they could watch more at night. They didn't know O.J. Simpson. They didn't know anyone involved in the case, yet they gave up days and weeks of their lives addicted to someone else's drama. I remembered that Mori said during our visit. The culture we have does not make people feel good about themselves, and you have to be strong enough to say, if the culture doesn't work, don't buy it. Murray, true to these words, had developed his own culture long before he got sick. Discussion groups, walks with friends, dancing to his music in the Harvard Square Church. He started a project called Greenhouse where poor people could receive mental health services. He read books to find new ideas for his classes, visited with colleagues, kept up with old students, wrote letters to distant friends. He took more time eating and looking at nature and wasted no time in front of TV sitcoms or movies of the week. He had created a cone of human activities, conversation, interaction, affection, and it filled his life like an overflowing soup bowl. I had also developed my own culture, work. I did 4 or 5 media jobs in England, juggling them like a clown. I spent 8 hours a day on a computer feeding my stories back to the States. Then I did TV pieces, traveling with a crew throughout parts of London. I also phoned in radio reports every morning and afternoon. This was not an abnormal load. Over the years, I had taken labor as my companion and had moved everything else to the side. In Wimbledon, I ate meals at my little wooden work cubicle and thought nothing of it. On one particularly crazy day, a crush of reporters had tried to chase down Andre Agassi and his famous girlfriend Brooke Shields, and I had gotten knocked over by a British photographer who barely muttered sorry before sweeping past. His huge metal lenses strapped around his neck. I thought of something else Muri had told me. So many people walk around with a meaningless lives. They seem half asleep even when they are busy doing things they think are important. This is because they are chasing the wrong things. The way you get meaning into your life is to devote yourself to loving others. Devote yourself to your community around you and devote yourself to creating something that gives you purpose and meaning. I knew he was right. Not that I did anything about it. At the end of the tournament and the countless cups of coffee I drank to get through it, I closed my computer, cleaned out my cubicle, and went back to the apartment to pack. It was late, the TV was nothing but fuzz. I flew to Detroit, arrived late in the afternoon, dragged myself home, and went to sleep. I awoke to a jolting piece of news. The unions at my newspaper had gone on strike. The place was shut down. There were picketers at the front entrance and marchers chanting up and down the street. As a member of the union, I had no choice. I was suddenly and for the first time in my life out of a job, out of a paycheck, and pitted against my employers. Union leaders called my home and warned me against any contact with my former editors, many of whom were my friends, telling me to hang up if they tried to call and plead their case. We are going to fight until we win, the union leaders swore, sounding like soldiers. I felt confused and depressed, although the TV and radio work were nice supplements. The newspaper had been my lifeline, my oxygen. When I saw my stories in print in each morning, I knew that in at least one way I was alive. Now it was gone, and as the strike continued, the first day, the second day, the third day, there were worried phone calls and rumors that this could go on for months. Everything I had known was upside down. There were sporting events each night that I would have gone to cover. Instead, I stayed home, watched them on TV. I had grown used to thinking readers somehow needed my column. I was stunned at how easily things went on without me. After a week of this, I picked up the phone and dialed Muri's number. Connie brought him to the phone. You are coming to visit me, he said, less a question than a statement. Well, could I? How about Tuesday? Tuesday would be good, I said. Tuesday would be fine. In my sophomore year, I take two more of his courses. We go beyond the classroom, meeting now and then just to talk. I have never done this before with an adult who was not a relative, yet I feel comfortable doing it with Muri. And he seems comfortable making the time. Where shall we visit today? He asks cheerily when I enter his office. In the spring, we sit under a tree outside the sociology building, and in the winter, we sit by his desk, me in my grey sweatshirts and Adidas sneakers, Muri in Rockport shoes and corduroy pants. Each time we talk, he listens to me ramble. Then he tries to pass on some sort of life lesson. He wants me that money is not the most important thing, contrary to the popular view on campus. He tells me I need to be fully human. He speaks of the alienation of youth and the need for connectedness with the society around me. Some of these things I understand, some I do not. It makes no difference. The discussions give me an excuse to talk to him. Fatherly conversations I cannot have with my own father, who would like me to be a lawyer. Muri hates lawyers. What do you want to do when you get out of college? He asks. I want to be a musician, I say, piano player. Wonderful, he says. But that's a hard life, yeah. A lot of sharks, that's what I hear. Still, he says, if you really want it, then you will make your dreams happen. I want to hug him to thank him for saying that, but I am not that open. I only nod instead. I will bet you play piano with a lot of pep. He says. I laugh. Pep. He laughs back. Pep, what's the matter? They don't say that anymore. The first Tuesday we talk about the world. Connie opened the door and let me in. Muri was in his wheelchair by the kitchen table, wearing a loose cotton shirt and even looser black sweatpants. They were loose because his legs had atrophied beyond normal clothing size. You could get two hands around his thighs and have your fingers touch. Had he been able to stand, he would have been no more than 5 feet tall, and he would probably have fit into a sixth grader's jeans. I got you something, I announced, holding up a brown paper bag. I had stopped on my way from the airport at a nearby supermarket and purchased some turkey, potato salad, macaroni salad, and bagels. I knew there was plenty of food at the house, but I wanted to contribute something. I was so powerless to help Muri otherwise. And I remembered his fondness for eating. Ah, so much food, he said. Well, now you have to eat it with me. We sat at a kitchen table surrounded by wicker chairs. This time, without the need to make up 16 years of information, we slid quickly into the familiar waters of our old college dialogue. Muri asking questions, listening to my replies, stopping like a chef to sprinkle in something I had forgotten or hadn't realized. He asked about the newspaper strike and true to form. He couldn't understand why both sides didn't simply communicate with each other and solve their problems. I told him not everyone was as smart as he was. Occasionally, he had to stop to use the bathroom, a process that took some time. Connie would wheel him to the toilet, then lift him from the chair and support him as he urinated into the beaker. Each time he came back, he looked tired. Do you remember when I told Ted Koppel that pretty soon someone was gonna have to wipe my ass? He said. I laughed. You don't forget a moment like that. Well, I think that day is coming. That one bothers me. Why? Because it's the ultimate sign of dependency. Someone wiping your bottom, but I am working on it. I am trying to enjoy the process. Enjoy it. Yes, after all, I get to be a baby one more time. That's a unique way of looking at it. Well, I have to look at life uniquely now. Let's face it. I can't go shopping. I can't take care of the bank accounts. I can't take out the garbage, but I can sit here with my dwindling days and look at what I think is important in life. I have both the time and the reason to do that, so I said in a reflexively cynical response. I guess the key to finding the meaning of life is to stop taking out the garbage. He laughed, and I was revealed that he did. As Connie took the plates away, I noticed a stack of newspapers that had obviously been read before I got there. You bother keeping up with the news? I asked. Yes, Muri said. Do you think that's strange? Do you think because I am dying, I shouldn't care what happens in this world? Maybe, he sighed. He sighed. Maybe you are right. Maybe I shouldn't care. After all, I won't be around to see how it all turns out, but it's hard to explain much. Now that I am suffering, I feel closer to people who suffer than I ever did before. The other night on TV, I saw people in Bosnia running across the street, getting fired upon, killed innocent victims, and I just started to cry. I feel their anguish as if it were my own. I don't know any of these people, but how can I put this? I am almost drawn to them. His eyes got moist, and I tried to change the subject, but he dabbed his face and waved me off. I cry all the time now, he said. Never mind, amazing. I thought I worked in the news business. I covered stories where people died. I interviewed grieving family members. I even attended the funerals. I never cried. Moody, for the suffering of people half a world away, was weeping. Is this what comes at the end? I wondered. Maybe death is the great equalizer. The one big thing that can finally make strangers shed a tear for one another. Mori honked loudly into the tissue. This is okay with you, isn't it? Man crying. Sure, I said too quickly. He grinned. Ah, Mitch, I am gonna loosen you up. One day I am gonna show you it's okay to cry. Yeah, yeah, I said. We laughed because he used to say the same thing nearly 20 years earlier, mostly on Tuesdays. In fact, Tuesdays had always been our day together. Most of my courses with Muri were on Tuesdays. He had office hours on Tuesdays, and when I wrote my senior thesis, which was pretty much Muri's suggestion, right from the start, it was on Tuesdays that we sat together by his desk, or in the cafeteria, or on the steps of Pearlman Hall going over the work. So it seemed only fitting that we were back together on a Tuesday here in the house with the Japanese maple out front. As I readied to go, I mentioned this to Muri. We are Tuesday people, he said. Tuesday people, I repeated. Muri smiled. Mitch, you asked about caring for people I don't even know, but can I tell you the thing I am learning most with this disease? What's that? The most important thing in life is to learn how to give out love and to let it come in. His voice dropped to a whisper. Let it come in. We think we don't deserve love. We think if we let it in, we will become too soft. But a wise man named Levine said it right. He said, love is the only rational act. He repeated it carefully, pausing for effect. Love is the only rational act. I nodded like a good student, and he exhaled weakly. I leaned over to give him a hug, and then, although it is not really like me, I kissed him on the cheek. I felt his weakened hands on my arms, the thin stubble of his whiskers brushing my face. So you will come back next Tuesday, he whispered. He enters the classroom, sits down, doesn't say anything. He looks at us. We look at him. At first there are a few giggles, but Muri only shrugs, and eventually a deep silence falls, and we begin to notice the smallest sounds, the radiator humming in the corner of the room, the nasal breathing of one of the fat students. Some of us are agitated. When is he going to say something? We squirm. Check over what. A few students look out the window, trying to be above it all. This goes on a good 15 minutes before Muri finally breaks it with a whisper. What's happening here? He asks, and slowly a discussion begins, as Muri has wanted all along, about the effect of silence on human relations. Why are we embarrassed by silence? What comfort do we find in all the noise? I am not bothered by the silence for all the noise I make with my friends. I am still not comfortable talking about my feelings in front of others, especially not classmates. I could sit in the quiet for hours if that is what the class demanded. On my way out, Muri stops me. You didn't say much today, he remembers. I don't know, I just didn't have anything to add. I think you have a lot to add. In fact, Mitch, you remind me of someone I knew who also liked to keep things to himself when he was younger. Who? Me.